All right, welcome to episode 2 of the SumerSports show. I'm Eric Eager. I'm with Thomas Dimitrov. We're a little early this week. Both of us are traveling. And so Wednesday was not going to work the best. And so we're going to gift everybody here, the loyal listeners, of which we're very, very enthusiastic about the download numbers and the turnout last week. The loyal listeners are ready. We'll get a treat here as I'll post this up Sunday night. It'll probably be about halfway through the Cincinnati Bengals Baltimore Ravens Sunday night game. Thomas, how you doing?
I'm good. What a day. I mean, you remember training day when Denzel said, "What an MFing day?" That's kind of how I felt. I was thinking if I were to be a GM in a number of these games, I would have been losing my mind. It was unbelievable. I loved watching it. Don't get me wrong. It was crazy. But look, the fact that I'm going to be in Paris this week and on my honeymoon with my lovely wife, Mimi, is a big deal for me. I have not traveled literally in my entire life, 55 plus years. I've never traveled in the fall. So this is really, really rare for me.
Yeah. And then congratulations, obviously, on the marriage and on finding a good time, starting it off right by showing her that she's more important than football in the fall. I love that move. It's a very strategic one that I think is very smart to do. I'm in Lincoln, Nebraska. I am giving a couple of guest lectures at the university. I may or may not make a joke about how Nebraska has tried everything at the head coaching position other than a mathematician. Maybe throw my hat in the ring there a little bit for them. But it'll be a good time. I have not been back to Lincoln. This is 5 years or so, which, in football years is a lifetime. So I'm really excited about that. But yeah, so neither one of us are really going to be available on Wednesday, nor would I want you to even do the podcast if you're on your honeymoon. So really excited for you. Just a couple brief things like, this is episode 2 of the podcast. We're going to plan on doing one once a week for about 45 minutes every week. Our thought process right now is to have, discussions about the league in general, a little bit of game predictions, a little bit of just musing about what we think is going on. Thomas, of course, is a 2-time executive of the year of the NFL, the former general manager of the Falcons for 13 years. I ran research and development at Pro Football Focus. I was there for 7 years. And in the last 4 in that capacity. So hopefully we bring a never before heard, combination of those two perspectives. And as this grows, obviously we'll move into sort of some guests and some topics that, we can enlarge our perspective by bringing in others. But I think, for now, we watched games today, Thomas, and there were just anecdotes about anecdotes all around the league. And so in some ways, I think it's great that we're doing this right after, because I think it's fresh in our minds. I think it'll make for a good show.
I definitely do. Again, there are a lot of really interesting things happening from the perspective of team builders. I often look at those. I think I mentioned to you recently, as a former GM and as a GM, when you're watching games, you're watching to see what your buddies are doing. You're watching to see what your nemesis are doing. And you're just, and interestingly enough, you really dig in to see the nuance of the game, even sometimes beyond the scheme and such. It's what's going on within that organization, which is, I find fascinating.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's, there's so much. And I kind of want to get eventually to this topic with you. And maybe we'll just approach it now, and then we'll get to something else in a second. But like, when you watch these games, you have to have a long-term, view for these guys, right? And in some ways, a long-term empathy towards these guys, right? So you watch, you watch Denver on Thursday night, right? And Denver Indy could have gone either way, right? One team had to win that game, and by definition, one team had to lose that game. And you look at Chris Ballard, for example, and you're like, this guy's run into some bad luck at the quarterback position. Good for him to get a win here. But you look at Denver, and you're like, they kind of put everything into the middle of the table, and now they're 2-3. And you sort of think about down the road, because you have Russell Wilson tied up for so many years. You're kind of like, okay, where is the out there? You look at – go ahead.
Yeah, no, I was going to say those are great points. We look at that, and this isn't me just stroking here. Both of those gentlemen I'm talking about, George Payton and Chris Ballard, are really good football people with really good eyes. Plain and simple, they've been around it a long, long time. I've had this discussion with a lot of my buddies who are former GMs and who are current GMs, of course. We'll go back to talking to Dave Caldwell and Ryan Griggs, and some people that I think are some of the best evaluators that have been around. Unfortunately, there's more to this, of course, than just evaluation prowess, right? We can go on, and I can't wait over the sessions and the time that we spend in these podcasts to talk about some of that nuance. It's very important. It could be the decisions that you're making. It could be the coaching staff that you have. It could be your relationship with the owner and how you're putting your team together. There are myriad issues for an organization rising and falling and rising and falling. And to me, it is beyond fascinating.
Yeah, absolutely. And sometimes these things are, I was interviewed. It was kind of a weird, like, where were you moment, but like I was interviewed last week by the Pioneer Press, which was the newspaper I got as a kid. And they were asking about Ryan Poles and Kwesi Adofo-Mensah, and like kind of because they face each other today. And, the Bears very much did a tear it down and try to build it up type of thing around a young quarterback. And the Vikings basically did a, hey, let's run the thing back around a veteran quarterback in Kirk Cousins. And, I was looking at that and thinking, okay, like there's a fair amount of, just like projection that you have to do, right? Like it's not even like, because I look at the Vikings, they're 4-1, right? Now after beating Chicago. You look at their draft picks. Lewis Cine was their first round draft pick. He was only playing special teams and then kind of gruesomely broke his leg last week. Andrew Booth is only playing special teams as their second round pick. Another second round pick, Ed Ingram, is starting at guard for them. And then everybody beyond that is a reserve at this point, right? So they have a rookie class that's not really making an impact. But at the same time, Kwesi Adofo-Mensah saw the league as being flatter than I think even like folks like me did, and said, look, all we have to do is lay this thing up on the green and we're going to win some games, right? And does that buy you goodwill early on? I mean, in your career, right? Like you guys busted out of the gate and went, I think 10-6, 11-5 right away. Got a playoff spot in the AFC South right away. And that, of course, like helps. That helps morale. It helps everything, work out for the good. And, whereas Ryan Poles, he saw the league and said, look, we're not good enough. Next year, we're going to have $115 million of salary cap space. So let's trade Khalil Mack while we can for value. Let's build, let's let Allen Robinson go. Let's all this kind of stuff. And you're building the roster from the studs around a rookie quarterback, or a quarterback on a rookie deal in Justin Fields. And it's a different approach. They're not going to compete this year. And the NFC is very winnable, in that way. So in some ways, in year one, Kwesi's come out ahead. I wonder about years, 2 and beyond.
Well, so again, think about this as a team builder, a general manager getting your first time gig. You walk in the doors, your owner's excited, your organization's excited. You finally get back to your office and you sit down and you wonder, where in the hell am I going with this team? And you have to be honest with yourself. You have to be honest with your conversations with your owner, of course, and with your head coach, either to be while you're looking for him or the person that is actually in with you. I would say this, too oftentimes people can come in and say, I have a mulligan in my first year, right? That's what they would say, because we have a quarterback that's still under contract that we have to go with this year, or something happened with a coach that I'm sort of adopting and I'll look to change potentially next year. Those are interesting scenarios. I look at myself and a number of other people who had to jump right in, and believe me, this is not a dart at Arthur Blank, but I guarantee you, if we didn't get things off the mark by the second year, and we luckily went 11-5 that first year, to your point, there's no way I would have had a long career in Atlanta at all. I was very fortunate that we were able to pick Matt and we were able to get, Michael Turner in as a free agent. And in the next couple of years, obviously get Tony Gonzalez. We had no mulligans here in Atlanta. So when you look around the league and you look at some of these general managers, sometimes they come in, again, a little bit more subdued, and other times they know they have to make the mark. Now, I have always believed, the last thing I'll leave you with on this note, I am so not a person that wants to sit on my hands. This is a not for long league. Everyone's heard that line, but I'm telling you, to the core, you can close the door on any one of these GMs that want to fiddle around to try to say they have a year or a year and a half to get things done. they know if they don't capitalize and they're not aggressive in doing what they're doing, there is no way they'll survive into their second contract.
Yeah, that's what I get worried about when I think of Poles because, for one, his moves didn't necessarily suggest that they were all in on Justin Fields, right? Because that's, and that's that's an experience, you weren't fortunate enough to have, or maybe you were fortunate not to have, which is, you have the quarterback on rookie deal money, right? So he's making, the year that Joe Burrow entered the league, he was making $10 million per year. And the next highest paid starter was Teddy Bridgewater at $20 million. There was a $10 million gap between the best young starter and the worst veteran starter. And so then you take that surplus and you pile it around a team. Unfortunately, like the Bears didn't have that as their reality. So Justin Fields is working with a small, worse deck of cards than most guys, but they're also not trusting him, right? Like he's not throwing the ball as much. I think today he had his best game to his credit, and they almost came back from 21-3 down to beat the Vikings. So I thought he was very impressive today. But like there's, you're right though. Like that's the blueprint, right? If you're Zach Taylor in Cincinnati, you get Joe Burrow, then you go for Chase and Higgins and the offensive line, and then you buoy the defense a little bit, and that's the formula. And you try to win in that window. And that's what I worry about with Poles because obviously, let's say Justin Fields isn't the quarterback he preferred, then he's got to kind of wait it out for him with a few years. And then you basically get one shot at drafting a quarterback, and that's your guy. And if he's not good, then, you're stuck. And we look at, you look around the league, and that's kind of, you don't get too many chances at two quarterbacks in the draft. And so, and you can maybe talk about this a little bit, is like, evaluating quarterbacks is so hard to basically only give a guy one chance at it seems a little bit rough to me for general managers around the league.
Oh, it is rough. I mean, quarterbacks, look, it's such a precarious position. We think that, you can kind of know a quarterback the way he does this, or this, and right away whether he's going to be a star. And you and I both know that's not the case. I mean, it is a complicated deal. Can I just quickly, the quarterback discussion we'll have many, many times over all of these pods. I just think right now where we are, can I segue back in quickly to Kwesi Adofo-Mensah for a minute? Yep. Can we talk a little bit about how monumental this sort of you have a guy like Kwesi, very, very smart, has a basketball background. For a lot of the people that are sort of analytics and data science directed, this is a big, big deal for this league. The last time that we had someone who was coming in full force as a data scientist background was how many years ago in Cleveland with Sashi Brown, who, by the way, Sashi is another very, very incredibly smart person and tried like hell to get things off the ground there. Of course, it was a mess. The way that things went with he and Hugh Jackson, it never worked. But it unfortunately put a little bit of a shot at the knees for a lot of the data scientists within the league who were hoping to either be assistant GMs or general managers in the future. This is big for the Vikings. It's big for Kwesi and all of your group. And I'm saying your group, you're a football guy at the core, but you're also incredibly smart from a data scientist standpoint. Let's talk about this for a minute, please, because this is big.
Yeah, and one of the quotes I had in the Pioneer Press article is exactly that, which is like, for one, you have a guy who, Kwesi's a person of color too, so like there's that kind of singularity. Now the league has grown, actually, the number of general managers, Brad Holmes and Andrew Berry. Like I think the league is trending in the right direction in that regard, but that's one thing that makes it harder, right? And then you are kind of a singular person and being an analytics person. And that was when I took a step back and thought about it. I said, okay, you have a 4-year contract, which is different. Ryan Poles is a 5-year contract too. So when I was thinking about would they extend Kirk Cousins or would they move on for a different quarterback, I thought to myself, I'm like, okay, you only have 4 years. Are you going to waste 2 of them on Kirk Cousins? Was my thought process. But his thought process was everything's winnable, right? And I can win this with Kirk. And the funny thing is Kirk Cousins is not playing that well relative to what he did last season. And they're still winning these games. And now, to your point, he's a standard bearer for people like me, right? And so when I look at him and I say, oh, that's he's 4-1, like I'm rooting for the guy because like it's sort of he represents what we represent, and
Exactly.
to me it's a huge feather in his cap that they've started out okay. And I know people and we'll talk about this in a second. They're 1-4 against the spread, so like if you bet on the Vikings, you've lost money, but they're winning these close games. And I think like last season they were 9-8. But all of the games they lost that Kirk Cousins started were 1-score games, right? And so he kind of could see that roster was 8-9, and they were a little bit better than their record indicated. Now they just get a little more lucky, right? And they're 4-1, and he deserves a great deal of credit as somebody who is holding the torch for people like me, and it's really cool to see him get off to such a great start.
My very last point on this, great points, Eric, is if you go back to the mid 2000s, I think those are the years when Sashi Brown was at Cleveland. There were a lot of people in our league who were just getting into the analytic side of it, meaning the general managers who were really hesitant about doing anything with it. And they knew that it was heading in that direction, but they were slow playing it. There were many, many people in the league, again, massively cheering against Sashi, not Sashi the person, because Sashi is a very good, but Sashi the concept.
The idea.
And it was tough for them. That many years later, I believe there are a lot more people, of course, the data scientists in the league and the salary cap people in the league that are cheering for Kwesi. But also, I believe there's more understanding, and there's more sort of indirect cheering for a guy like Kwesi Adofo-Mensah, not only because, like you mentioned, there's an underrepresented element to it, but also because of where he is from a data scientist standpoint, because the league is so much more comfortable. The league knows. This is why I'm involved in SumerSports, to be honest with you. We can talk about that another time. It is the evolution of the league. And what Kwesi has on his shoulders is really, really interesting. And he is such a well thought out person, of course, very intelligent and articulate. It will be really interesting to see, the ups and downs of this career, because there's a lot of pressure on Kwesi. And like everyone else, I'm cheering for him, and I think things are going to go well for him. Time will tell, of course.
Yeah, and to his credit, he has done a great job of bridging the gap a little bit and bringing in Ryan Grigson, as his VP of I think player personnel, or like he's certainly not shunning what we would consider traditional voices in the room, which I think is an incredibly savvy move on his part. But also, when he was with Cleveland, like he went and scouted on the road, like he wanted to know, like to me, I think he was very prepared for this moment from that perspective of not being naive and knowing, because ultimately, and we have this, at SumerSports, back when I was in Pro Football Focus, it was the same thing. But anybody that comes in and says, "Hey, we can help you do your job," people say, "Well, you want to replace me," and I think there's a very we're not. I mean, I know at SumerSports we're not trying to replace people. And, when you come in, you're like, no, we're trying to do what you do and enhance. We're trying to get you to do the same thing you were always doing, but we want to get more value out of it. And it wasn't, like if you scout a player and give them a 7 or something like that, like that's your job. And where we failed in the past is really knowing what that 7 means in the context of everything. What data science is trying to do is say, no, go out there, put that 7 on that player, and then we'll try to say what that means vis-a-vis drafting, signing, all that kind of stuff. It doesn't negate the importance of the person charting the game or padding the game or whatever. What it does is enhances the the strength or the usefulness of that data, because ultimately they're collecting data the same way that we were at PFF or whatever. And in fact, I would say probably, if you're a scout in the NFL, you're probably collecting it at a more rigorous standard than anybody else's.
We use the phrase, and this all the time, augment, augment, augment. You take the really good football person and you can augment with a tool like we have it at SumerSports, and a methodology and an approach that we're working on, which we are really, really passionate about without getting into a ton of detail on it. You mentioned there a minute ago, and one of my good friends, and I'm not just pumping him for this reason, Ryan Grigson is a stud as far as evaluating football person. I know things went the way they went. He had one of the highest percentages, by the way, in the league. He really, I mean, if you look at his winning percentages in those 4 years, whatever anyone wants to say, the fact that Kwesi brought him in to be, essentially his right-hand guy, to have that football knowledge, that's amazing. This is where we have this discussion with Paul Tudor Jones, our founder and chairman. Where are we going in the next 5 years? Is it going to be general managers in the general manager spot with an AGM who is a data scientist, or is it going to be the data scientist with the AGM being the football, maybe a former GM or a rising stud within the football side? I think there's going to be some really interesting sort of leveling out of it, and I think it's good for the league as long as we continue to educate the football people and they don't just fall off the side of the earth because they're not willing to learn what we know is so important as we're evolving.
Yeah. And that's something too, that when you think about, the space of football like I call it football education. I'm a former professor. Like newsflash, no one's giving these courses, right? No one's doing this. And, there's a space to do this, right? There's a space. I mean, you and I, like the reason, the last year you and I worked together, and honest to goodness, it was like, you taught me so much about how people in the league think. And hopefully I told you sort of like how everything is supposed to be sort of on the front end. My mic is being a little bit funny here. But it's important for guys like us. And you had John Taormina at the Falcons, good friend of mine. Just talked to him on the phone for a while this week. He's a great human being. It's interesting, right? Because this is a relationship business, right? Like this is one where you develop a rapport with somebody, and then you're like, hey, does anybody know how to talk this? Does anybody know how to talk me through this thing? And it's like, well, Thomas does. And then you sort of, and good on Kwesi for expanding his network to the point where now I think he's going to end up having he's going to have more success than he would have otherwise. And that's, of course, it doesn't matter how you get that success in this world, right? It just matters that you have it.
Great topic. Thanks for having that conversation.
Okay, I want to talk about close games because it's so fun. So I'm here. I'm watching Red Zone with my PhD advisor, Richard, who it was so funny because we have such a great relationship, even though he has interest in music the way that I have interest in football. And so we were talking, and I said something offhand, like, because we were watching Red Zone, which if people don't watch Red Zone, it's amazing. It's like you have this like whole game that plays out for 3 quarters. And I guarantee you those 3 quarters matter. But basically you get the 4th quarter and 70% of these games are 1-score games where all it is just some noise at the end, right? Like, you throw a pick, you get a sack, a guy misses a field goal like in Arizona, and the game ends weirdly. And we're all like, oh my God. And the first 3 quarters of the game, unless you're playing fantasy or prop betting or something, like ultimately doesn't matter that much weirdly. And I made a flippant comment to him. I'm like, well, yeah, like close games don't really indicate anything about a team. He's like, what do you mean? I'm like, well, if you go back and take a team's win-loss record and you just give them half a win for every game that is decided by a touchdown or less, and you use that number to predict how many games they're going to win in the future, it does better, and markedly so, than if you just take their win-loss record. So basically, and maybe I'm talking about both sides of my mouth because the Vikings have basically won all their games by 1 score, except for the Packers one. But basically, these close score games, we derive a ton from them because it's 1 out of 17 for everyone. But in reality, take a step back and say, okay, who's gotten lucky in close games? Who's gotten screwed? Does a general manager, when you're looking, because you're in the get it right business, you're in the win business, you can't go to your owner and be like, look, man, if you give us half a win, for every game within 7 points, we're a 500 team. You can't do that. How do you take that? Because it's got to be maddening in one sense that like there's so much of this stuff that you can't control, and yet you're being evaluated by it.
Okay, that's a long, drawn out conversation with a lot of emotion in it, Eric. For any of those of us who have been in the league in that position as a GM, who have been fired as a GM, I mean, there is a lot of passion there, right? Let me first start by saying, categorically, nothing matters but the wins. And we can all say, and after games, Arthur could come in, and Arthur Blank, I'm speaking of course, the owner of the Falcons, could come in after, 13 years of games and the ups and downs that I felt, the hot seat that I was on many, many times, like any general manager. We could talk about it after the game and suggest, like, that was a really good game by Matt, or Julio Jones did this, or our defense and Deion Jones was flying around, and our young cornerback. We can have those conversations, but at the end of the year, all of that is for naught. It doesn't really matter, because if we were below 500, which was the starting point, of course, you had to be much better than that. It didn't matter, because it was logged as a losing season, one season closer to the termination of the regime. Now, let me just say, with that said, that's not being negative. It's being realistic, and we all know it. So you see games out there where some of these people win, and they're if you really dug down and did what we also do, because we do look at the minutia, because we want to see what's going wrong, what we need to do next year to draft. Even though we're winning games or losing games, we might be losing games because the proverbial ball isn't bouncing our way, Eric. But we have a really good defensive backfield, and we have a really good D-line, but, we're not winning. So do we go on the draft and try to change those position groupings? No, of course, we're looking at all the other statistics that we've derived from those losses or those wins, and to try to determine where we are. So we don't throw the baby out with the bathwater, so to speak. It's about wins. Our owner knows it's about wins, and no one's surviving in this league. Sorry, I shouldn't say no one, because our good friend Les Snead, if I'm not mistaken, did he go 6 years in St. Louis without an above 500?
He went a while, and they didn't win much. I mean, they were competitive, but they didn't win much.
They were competitive, and he is a really good football guy, and he knows it inside out. And it's funny, they didn't, but they had an owner, which is a whole other topic here, right? The owner looked at it for many years and held his water and kept his people around, the people that he knew were good, not only in what they're doing, but also good matches with the president, good matches with the head coaches. I think it has a lot to do with the entire organization, and at every level, and it starts with the owner. The owner has to have patience and a long-range view, like his general manager, to make sure they're putting the right people in the right places. Of course, a head coach is never going to have as long of a view. You hope he still has a mature view looking at your team.
Yeah, that's so well said. And I think it's very interesting, because I always bring this up, because when I was talking, when I was talking about sports betting when I was at PFF a lot, I would say stuff like, this team, they're not as good as their record, or they're not as bad as their record. And I think that really matters. The point that you made about staying the course versus a redirect is extremely important to me, right? Like, I think of, there's two teams that actually like come to my mind where one team had a really proper evaluation of how good or bad they were, and one team didn't, and it ruined a regime. In the 2008 Packers, right? So, that was the year they traded Brett Favre to the Jets. They go with Aaron Rodgers the first game, the first year for Aaron Rodgers. That team, that was your first year as well as general manager. But the Packers went 6-10. In fact, I want to say they had a 3-point loss at home to your Falcons. And the crazy thing is, if you look at these losses, right? So this is a Packers team in 2007 that went to the NFC title game, lost to the Giants. Favre retires. They go with Rodgers. They have a losing season. You look at their losses: a 11-point loss, a 9-point loss, a 3-point loss, another 3-point overtime loss, a 1-point loss, a 23-point loss, and then 4-point loss, 3-point loss, 4-point loss, 3-point loss. And so when you look, they actually outscored their opponents that year, but they went 6-10. So by all indications, they were a playoff team fundamentally, but they don't have the results. Now, what you get from that is 2009, you get to pick, higher in the draft. You get to get Clay Matthews. You get to build that defense. Now, that 2009 team actually switched from a 4-3 to a 3-4 with Dom Capers, which I eventually thought was instrumental in their Super Bowl run. But mostly what it didn't do is it didn't put Rodgers on the hot seat, right? It was one of those like, oh, your first year as a starter didn't work out that well, but you take a little bit of a peek, and it's actually a lot better than what you think, right? So we're going to stay the course. We're going to try to do it the right way. Next year, they're 11-5. Following year, they win a Super Bowl. And it's kind of like, that was like an aha moment for me. It was like, you do have to look at these fundamentals. Flip side, last time the Lions were in the playoffs, 2016. And they won 8 of their 9 games were won by fourth quarter comebacks. So they make the playoffs. They get killed in the playoffs by Seattle. In fact, they lost their last 3 games. But they basically just ran it back in 2017. And running it back in 2017, same personnel, same everything, for a team that was not as good as their record, 9-7, right? And a playoff loss. Making no changes really. Coming back the next year and they went 9-7 in 2017 as well, but they lost some high profile games. They missed the playoffs, and I got Jim Caldwell, fired, as well as the regime. And again, I think like if they were, and maybe they were in the room, I'm just sort of like, projecting, but looking at that team with maybe more of a sober eye, maybe would have allowed them to course correct and would have kept some people their jobs.
Yeah, the sober eye thing, man, we could go on and on about that. It is a great point. It's not always easy to do so on so many levels. Might be for another conversation for sure. But suffice it to say, back to wins, back to ownership, relationship between your team builders and your owner and what's expected. This is a whole other topic about expectations, right, Eric? I mean, managing expectations. I come from an organization, one of the main organizations coming from having been the Patriots. I mean, there was an over-the-top element of managing expectations. I get into Atlanta back in 2008, and the expectations weren't that high. They weren't that high, at least amid the media and the fan base, of course, but they were with our owner, and our owner had high expectations. And there are a lot of owners out there. I'm sure Mr. Tepper at the Carolina Panthers has high expectations right now. He, of course, wants to win games, but he also is looking critically. He's looking critically at what's going on with that football team, and he has to figure out in his mind probably what's going on and how they're going to approach things, as the quarterback settles in. And yep. It's just a fascinating situation when you look at the organization, big picture, and how they're going to navigate through some of these really complicated times when wins ultimately are the most important thing.
Yeah, for sure. And yeah, it's so interesting. And this brings me to the second topic I wanted to talk about, which is practice squad stuff. Okay. So I was watching, and like, again, the Kansas City Chiefs are the team I follow the most closely just because of, fandom and all this stuff. But like, I noticed that the Chiefs signed Chris Conley the other day to play on their practice squad. Now, that might not mean a lot to people, but Conley was a 3rd-round pick out of Georgia in 2015. He started for the team for 3 years. Then he left in 2019 to go play for the Jaguars and then for the Texans. He got released after training camp. Now they bring him back. Practice squads used to be, 6 or 7 guys? And so I think when practice squads were smaller and you didn't have eligibility if you were a veteran, it was all trivial, right? Now practice squads are 16 guys long. But what I'm noticing is you see a lot more veterans on practice squads now that it's allowed. And I think it's for obvious reasons. Like, you want a guy who knows how to run your practice. You want guys who are in the building who you're familiar with and all that, so on and so forth. But is it good for the league? Is it good for the teams for veterans to be this represented on practice squads?
Is it good to have the practice squad extended? No question about it. We've been looking to do this for years and years and years. I was fortunate to be on the general manager's advisory committee, and how many times we brought this up to the competition committee, to our own owners. It was a long, drawn-out process, and I unfortunately was a part of the practice squad years where, it was sub 10. It got to 10, and it got to 12. And then, of course, when COVID came around, when I was no longer around, of course, it got up, it increased to 16. We always wanted more players. We wanted more players for injury reasons, of course. We wanted more players for special teams reasons. There were just so many elements to increasing and improving what we thought was going to help the league regarding practice squad. I get the point in the argument out there that it doesn't help with the development as much because you're bringing in, X amount of veterans, 6 to 10 or whatever that may be now. Mm-hmm. That can also be helpful for your practice squad people because They're interacting with those other practice squad players. There are many ways to continue to develop your team. And I think you could ask most people in the league, yes, developing the young guys is important, but having an adept enough practice squad where you truly can move your own people up is a boon for the league in my mind.
Yeah, I agree with you. I think if you view it as additive, it certainly matters. Like, because back in the day there were like 4 to 6 guys, right? And eventually became 8. And I do think the difficulty is, right, without an official developmental league and without the practice reps that they even had when you started at Atlanta, right? Like, it's just so reduced now. That's where I get worried. I get worried about, I think I trace back a lot of the quarterback stuff. We'll talk about Geno Smith in a second, but like, I think about the quarterback stuff where it's like, if a guy is going back and forth between practice squads, right, is he ever really learning any one playbook that well? Like, I think of like the quarterbacks who were in the Super Bowls and practice squad is usually where the third quarterback sits now, because you can't designate a third quarterback anymore. And so there's a little bit of like, there's a little bit of flux, right? So I think about like 20 years ago, you had, Super Bowl quarterbacks like Brad Johnson and Rich Gannon and Jake Delhomme and Trent Green and like guys like that, who all of them were developmental guys, right? They were, Brad Johnson was 4th string on the Vikings behind Sean Salisbury, Jim McMahon, Gino Torretta, and then he's a Super Bowl quarterback, right? Like, and in today's day and age, he would have bounced between team to team by enough where you never know if he would have learned Brian Billick's offense that well, and he might not have been ready to prepare. And so that's where I get worried, is like, I want the practice squad to be a place where guys can go and develop in that system in a way where you get these super teams like you had prior to free agency, like in San Fran and so forth. That's my worry. But because there are more players, I'm okay with it in the sense that there are still some young players on the practice squad. I just don't know. When I'm thinking about Kansas City, they very clearly brought Chris Conley in because he knows how to practice with the Chiefs, right? And he's going to be a veteran presence there, and there are younger players, and that's cool. But from the perspective of the Chiefs, like, I don't foresee Chris Conley having an impact on this team in sort of the measurable ways, if that makes sense.
Yeah, you hit the nail on the head along your discussion here. We often looked at our practice squad people and wanting to bring back certain people the next year because they knew our system, because they knew not only the scheme of the system, but how the whole world worked within the Atlanta Falcon paradigm, which was important for Dan Quinn, especially as we started growing. Of particular note here, this is probably good for the listeners to hear. A lot of people think, practice squad, they're the bottom end of the heap and this and that. I mean, Dan had a really good approach, and I think I realized more and more that the coaches in those positions now, the head coaches, looked upon their practice squad people as a legit part of their team, Eric. So 69 is the legit roster. You're not just, hey, we'll see you on the other side after we're back from the game. Like, we traveled with all of our practice squad people. They were in meetings. They were on the field before practice is working out, which, by the way, that is another thing that's really good for the league and for the teams. They get their practice squad people out on the field to do certain things within reason. Of course, there are stipulations with it, but it gives them an opportunity not just to not see the field from, look, you think when you're not playing and you're not practicing, you don't see the field hardly on Saturday, of course. You don't see the field on Sunday. You don't see the field on Monday for one reason or another. Tuesday's a day off. That's a long stretch for your practice squad people that are just yearning to grow and have sort of development. So I think there are some good rules with it, and long and short, it's good for the league.
Yeah, and as somebody myself who played 3 snaps my first 2 college seasons combined, I get what you're saying. Like, you have a 3-day practice week, right? And you're just running scout team. And to your point, like, there have to be programs around that. I'm glad to hear that teams are doing that. Let's hit on one more topic before we preview next week. Geno Smith, right? Geno is an example of a guy who has stuck around. He was good enough to be a second-string quarterback, and so he got that opportunity to stay in places like, he was with New York, but then he went to the Giants, and then he went to Seattle, and he's kind of had a chance to grow and mature. And now late in his career, I mean, he played a great game today against the Saints. I know he's not perfect, but he made some throws that I thought were amazing. Draft capital certainly shows up at a second-round pick out of Missouri. He's, a very good football player, but non-traditional, right? Because of how inexpensive it is. Just if you draft Sam Darnold, he's not good, you just go back into the draft and draft Zach Wilson, right? And it doesn't carry the price tag, the $50 million that Sam Bradford carried for the St. Louis Rams. It's not expensive to fail at that position, or it's not as expensive. And so I always feel like, Jerry Jones, he took a chance on Tony Romo, because it's like, if I hit on Tony Romo, I can have him for 2 years at cheap money, even when he's a star. And then, and I don't have to tank and go back into the draft. Jake Delhomme was the same thing for the Panthers, and so on. Nowadays, it's like there isn't that incentive anymore, because you can just go back in the draft. And yet Geno Smith has sort of popped up here and become a starter. Now, they're not winning. They're 2-3. But what do you make of this situation? Do you stick with him long term? Do you give him a contract? Do you make him earn it more? Like, I don't know. Like, it's such an interesting conversation about Geno Smith in Seattle.
I mean, it's so interesting. I think when you look at John Snyder, the general manager, and Pete Carroll, the head coach, really good working relationship. They know each other so well. They've been through the ups and downs of everything. This was a tough season for them. And it was tough, meaning coming into this season, right? Making decisions, finally, parting ways with Russell Wilson. I'm sure that was not, I know from a team builder standpoint, that is really, really heart tugging, and it has you going every which way. Again, dichotomous emotions about something like that. You bring in you have a guy like Geno in the house to take care of your business, and you're praying as the team builders that is a solid move. And it's shown so far that it's a solid move, right? Yep. And he's doing some really good things. It gives him an opportunity to think about what's the next step, but it also gives him an opportunity to realize that, like we talked about last week, I believe, you have a situation. They have a team that they can win or get really, really close in games, and they should probably be winning a couple more of the games. But it shows that they have a really good football team that they can grow with Geno doing what he's doing. Now, think about this. That said, we just talked a few minutes earlier about it's all about the wins. We can say all we want to say about Geno Smith. It's really cool to watch this. But we also have to keep in mind it's all about the wins, right?
Yeah, and in that division where you have the Niners at 3-2, you have the Rams and the Cardinals and the Seahawks all at 2-3. They're still in the mix, but it's not necessarily going to be as pretty for them. And it was a very interesting conversation, because there is risk with veteran quarterbacks in that you get a pop-up year and they're immediately very expensive, right? Like there's not a middle-class quarterback contract in this league very much anymore. You're either you have the Jameis Winston contract, the Mitch Trubisky contract, or you have the Kyler Murray contract. And so that makes it very hard for the Geno Smiths of the world, because there really isn't, you either have to commit to them, and Jalen Hurts is another one where do the Eagles commit or do they not commit, right? And there's big questions there that I think, make this discussion great, and why we will never run out of topics on the show, because
it's a great point. But think about this. Let me throw this out before we go on to our last topic. When you're a team builder at an NFL organization and you have such cachet that John Snyder and Pete Carroll have, you still are on a not for long deal in the National Football League, right? And of all people, they have so much cachet again that you would think they wouldn't be worrying about that. But it's human nature, right? And human nature is not only what's going on with them with their quarterback now. I guarantee you don't think they're looking at everything, even though they want to say, oh, it's not our business anymore with Russell. Are you kidding me? Holy smokes. That is a really, really interesting set of emotions that you're dealing with when out of the corner of your eye, you're watching and you're saying, I don't want to wish ill will on this quarterback that left us. Was how many years, 9 or 10-year Pro Bowler for us?
Yeah, he was, the best player probably in Seahawks history, right?
Right. And there's, again, part of the reason, or a very good reason that they are where they are, both of them, many contracts and great money and fame and fortune, is because of this man. And yet he leaves. And again, that's not something that they want to like completely fall back on them. Like, what were they thinking?
Yeah.
Russell Wilson's still thriving. So it's really, really interesting as the season folds. It'll be or rolls on and it folds. It'll be interesting to see how that plays out for
I think when they look around the league and look at how Colts are doing with Matt Ryan, the Rams are doing with Stafford, even though they did win a Super Bowl, how the Denver Broncos are doing with Russ, I actually think they probably feel a little bit relieved that they let the quarterback position breathe for a season or two. I always thought as a Chiefs fan that Alex Smith's years in Kansas City were so valuable, not because he made them Super Bowl contender, but because he was good enough to show us how good Tyreek Hill was and how good Travis Kelce was and how good. And I think Geno Smith's real value to the Seahawks in the end is going to be showing us how good Abraham Lucas and Charles Cross are at tackle and how, and keeping DK Metcalf engaged for the early parts of his contract. And once they get a rookie in, then things will blossom much like they did in the early part of last decade as well. Okay. Now we're
wait. Last thing. I got one more thing for you. You just got me stirred. I love it. You said let the quarterback position breathe. My God, as a general manager, if we could ever have such calmness, we need to take lessons from Eric Eager on that, because that's not how the NFL works normally.
No.
Good for you.
No, and it's not being able to do that has been one of the reasons why a guy who and you and people I trust think he's brilliant, and I don't have any reason to doubt. But a guy like Chris Ballard, he's just not. If they were just able to let the position breathe for a year, maybe they'd have a little bit of a different outcome than they've had over the past few. Now they did get a big win Thursday, which was fun to see. For there's a lot of good people in that Colts building. So cool. Let's talk about games. Okay. I want to talk about, for each one of us, it's a little too early in the week to talk about predictions. I want to say you and I split a little bit there last week. We both thought that the Rams were going to beat Dallas, and Cooper Rush is now 5-0 as a starter in the NFL. So you have to you basically charge that one to the game, as the kids say. The game I'm looking forward to next week the most is the aforementioned Kwesi Adofo-Mensah Minnesota Vikings. They're going to Miami to face the Dolphins. The Dolphins fell to 3-2 today. They got kind of beat up by the Jets. It was closer than I think the final score suggested, but the Jets outplayed them. Bridgewater got hurt early, concussion stuff. Tua obviously on the mend as well with similar issues. So Skylar Thompson out of Kansas State was the quarterback today. Was not terrible, but not, certainly not winnable. The Vikings continue to catch good luck. They go to Miami, right? Miami's going to wear the white jerseys. They're going to make the Vikings wear purple and sit in the sun all day. That's a game. If the Vikings are for real, they have to win that game, I think, and win it somewhat convincingly.
And we have no idea what kind of points are involved with this. It's way too early, you're saying, right?
They do have look-ahead lines, but with the quarterback, usually when a quarterback's hurt, they won't put a point spread out until we know at least somewhat who the quarterback will be. So that game, I do not believe has a point spread as of now. And so, yeah, that game's we're not gonna be able to know who's favored in that one. I do believe that before this week, the look-ahead line was a pick'em. So it was basically a coin flip between the Vikings and the Dolphins. So that one, that will be a close one. What's the game you're most looking forward to?
Look, I'm looking at Buffalo and the Chiefs. I know you would love to have taken the Chiefs as well, like talking about the Chiefs, because we know that's what you want to do. And thank you for allowing me to talk about this game. Let me first talk, Eric, about what I normally do. And I've said this before, looking at these games, a lot of times I'm looking at it from the perspective of the GMs who I feel like I have a really good relationship throughout the league, of course, having been in it as long as I have. Juxtaposing Buffalo with Brandon Beane and Kansas City with Brett Veach. Both, again, you guys continue to hear me say this, but I think there are some really talented people in our league. If I ever come across a general manager out there that I don't believe is worth lauding, maybe I don't laud them. These two guys are really good. You have both in the upper tier of GMs in our league right now, both young in the 4 or 5 range, right? 4 or 5 year range. Mm-hmm. the interesting thing is you have Brandon Beane, who's building a team with his head coach, Sean McDermott, really, really close, really dialed in on what they need to do as team builders together. And they've built something that I think is on its way. I hate throwing juggernaut, but I think it's just got so many strengths there. And I think the way they approach it together is vital. And they understand each other. They get each other. Their owners get them. They give them the proverbial keys, which is important. Flip it over to the other side. Kansas City, Brett Veach has got an amazing relationship with Andy Reid, right? They've worked together at Philly. They work together on the coaching side a lot. So Brett is a really, really important part of the Andy Reid setup there. Of course, there's a difference there. One side, and you may argue with me on this, and I'd love to hear your take. Buffalo really dialed in on where they're going with their analytics and their data science approach to football. Not saying it overrides everything, but they have a really good understanding of it. In no way am I saying that Brett Veach and Kansas City don't dial in on it and don't understand the importance, but they're not known in the league as a group that is like on the front end of the analytic approach. Can you comment on that? Because I just find it a fascinating juxtaposition, and I think they go in at it and look, in the end, I think Buffalo keeps their run rolling.
Yeah, there's some anecdotes here. Like, for one, Dennis Locke is the main guy there as far as analytics, and he ran that department when he was with the Dolphins. I believe he's from Western New York, so then he went back there and I taught out of a statistics textbook that he wrote when I was a professor. So, like, I have a great deal of respect for him. But you look and, like, I can find clues to know that a team is sharp. When Buffalo drafted running backs, they took Zach Moss and Devin Singletary, guys who did not have great speed profiles, but had great profiles in all the things that running backs do that is repeatable from college to pro, which is breaking tackles. Mm-hmm. And so you look and you're like, oh, like there are other teams and we can discuss them, but like when they make moves, I'm like, oh yeah, that's it. Right. And maybe, and I would write an article for PFF.com. I'm assuming, we'll have similar ones in Sumer where you're like, here's breaking down why the Cleveland Browns re-signed David Njoku for so much money. That kind of thing. You can get, for some of these teams, it's very clear where they're going from A to B. The Chiefs hired Mark Richards, who was on a big Data Bowl winning team, Minnesota kid like me. They've had Brant Tillis in there for a while. Who's very analytical as the cap guy for them. But you're right. And from an in-game perspective, Andy Reid does override, the folks that, he stated such recently that he sometimes overrides the analytics. Andy's been in this league. I mean, he's won 100 games for two different franchises. I think he has the cachet to do that. But one thing that I found was really interesting last year, and just like observing this team from afar, was Andy and Steve Spagnuolo. They took cues from Brett Veach last year and who they played. So traditionally, Steve Spagnuolo used to just play veterans. So he would play Daniel Sorensen over Juan Thornhill. He would play Ben Neiman over Nick Bolton. And Brett Veach would draft all these young, good athletes, and they would sit the bench for too long, in my opinion, right? And last year, there was a real big shift in the Chiefs playing the players that Brett Veach drafted. And it was, to me, and then this offseason was another one where they trade Tyreek Hill, they get 12 draft picks, and all the draft picks made sense. All this is to say is, I agree with everything you say about Buffalo. I think they're building an absolute brick house there. Kansas City, I think what you've seen over the last 18 months is Brett Veach really coming out of the shadow of Andy Reid a little bit and doing some things that are on par power-wise with Reid. And I think that's a good thing, right? Because Andy Reid's not going to coach forever, right? And you want to be able to have this team be good for a long time, and having an executive who starts to feel confident, starts to do some of the things in his image, I think that's valuable.
The very last thing I'll say about that, when I was traveling around doing the GM journey, I visited both Brandon Beane, of course, in Buffalo, as well as Brett out in Kansas City. And being around Brett and Coach Reid at the baseball game after our interview, and watching them interact, and hearing Andy's respect for Brett. Look, the reality is many, many times in this league, when there's a massive difference in age and experience, there's just a little bit of condescension there. A little, you can feel it, and it's not that way at all with them. They both respect each other at such an unbelievable level. They both are really talented at what they do. And I've said to them, and I said it in the podcast there, and I'll say it now. I told Brett, I said, Brett, man, you have the trifecta here, and he's a big horse guy, right? I don't know if you know that. And Brett, I said to him, I said, you have the owner, you have one of the very best owners in the league, you have one of the very best quarterbacks, I believe, in the league, and you have one of the very best coaches, man. You're riding it, ride it strong, play that into many, many contracts, brother, because that does not come along just every day.
Yeah, and there's, in a league where everybody's up and down, it's John Dorsey was here for a few of them, but they've won 6 straight AFC West titles. And prior to winning the AFC West consecutive years in 16 and 17, the franchise had never won the division twice in a row. So there is just, to your point, like at some level you say it's really hard to screw it up when you have great ownership, great quarterback, great coach, but teams do it. And the Chiefs haven't done it. And so they get a lot of credit here. We went a little over today, but we had some technical difficulties in between. Hopefully none of you noticed them. But look, if we're going to go over, it's better to go over. That means you have too much to talk about. And I feel like this podcast, we already have so much to talk about, and it's been a pleasure here. So as we send Thomas on his honeymoon and me to Lincoln, Nebraska, for Thomas Dimitroff, this is Eric Eager. This has been the second episode of the SumerSports Show.